My name's Louise, and I'm turning 34 this year. After graduating from college, I landed a job at a well-known major corporation. It was a dream job for many, offering a competitive salary even for new hires. However, the high salary came with its own price: constant business trips, long hours, and working on holidays. I spent half of each month away on business trips or training sessions, and overtime was a given. The job was exhausting, but I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. By the time I turned 28, I was promoted to department head, an impressive and rare achievement, especially for a woman in my company. 4 years ago, I married my boyfriend of 2 years, Brian. We met through a mutual friend who was concerned about my lack of interest in dating. I was fully committed to my career and had never felt the need for marriage. I genuinely believed I could live my whole life single, and I was perfectly fine with that. Brian, however, had different views. From the very beginning, he was clear about what he wanted. "I want to get married soon," he said. "I want kids too. Raising them when we're older is going to be harder, right?" His certainty clashed with my reluctance. I didn't want children, and the idea of marriage felt absurd, especially since we barely knew each other. At that time, I had just been promoted, and marriage or pregnancy was the last thing on my mind. Whenever Brian brought up the topic, I would gently push back. "You're rushing. We need to get to know each other better. Besides, marriage isn't just about us. It involves our families too." But Brian was persistent. Okay. Then let's get married after dating for 2 years. By then, we'll know each other well, right? To be honest, I didn't think we would last 2 years. But, to my surprise, we did. And in the end, I married him. During our relationship, Brian was faithful, responsible, and kind. He was hardworking and diligent, which I admired. However, there were always small things that bothered me, especially his ego. Whenever a senior at work corrected him, he would come home and rant. I did it because I thought it was the best decision, but they act so bossy. I don't need to be told what to do. After hearing his side of the story, it was clear that he had made mistakes, but he just couldn't handle criticism. It didn't matter if the feedback came from a superior or a colleague. He refused to accept it. Still, I overlooked these things. After all, no one is perfect. But then came a situation that made me question his priorities. When we decided to introduce our families over dinner, Brian chose an upscale restaurant that charged over $200 per person. I was taken aback. "That's way too expensive," I told him. "We should pick a more affordable place." But Brian was adamant. "This is important. If I choose a cheap restaurant, they'll think I'm stingy." I was irritated by his reasoning. If he wanted to impress everyone, shouldn't he be the one paying? But then he dropped another bombshell. "I can't cover dinner for 8 people with my salary. At most, I can pay for 3. So, can you cover the rest?" I was stunned. We had 4 people from each family, making a total of 8 guests. Yet, Brian had chosen an expensive restaurant he couldn't afford and was now asking me to pay for 5 people, more than half the bill. Reluctantly, I agreed, thinking it was a one-time thing. But what happened at dinner left me speechless. When the meal was coming to an end, Brian confidently announced, "Don't worry about the bill today. I'll take care of it." I was furious. He made it seem like he was paying for everyone when, in reality, I was covering most of it. But looking around, I saw how happy our families were. They were smiling, relaxed, and chatting as if this dinner was the start of something wonderful. So I stayed silent. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. If this was how Brian handled things now, what would happen in the future? Though I swallowed my words that night at the dinner, looking back, I think I made a mistake. I regret not calling off my marriage to Brian, a man so full of himself. After we got married, Brian's attitude toward me changed completely. He started speaking to me in a condescending manner, as if I were beneath him. Before marriage, he understood how demanding my job was and even promised to help with household chores. But once we were married, that promise vanished. "What will the neighbors think if they see a man hanging out laundry?" he scoffed. "Besides, housework is a woman's job, right? I work hard, so let me relax at home." It was infuriating. Did he really think people would be shocked by a man doing chores? His outdated mindset and domineering attitude frustrated me. Even though I was swamped with work, he never lifted a finger to help. But I tolerated it. I didn't mind doing housework. What I couldn't tolerate was what happened next. Brian's parents were farmers, and from what I gathered, they had always struggled financially. Now that they were in their 70s, farming had become even more difficult. Because of this, they frequently called Brian, asking him to send them money. At first, I sympathized. They were struggling after all. But within 6 months of getting married, I realized something shocking. Brian was sending his entire salary to his parents. Yes, all of it. That meant I was the only one covering our household expenses. When I finally confronted him, I said, "This is too much. It's ridiculous to cover all of our living expenses with just my salary." But Brian snapped back. "How can you say such a thing when my family is in trouble? They're your family too. Besides, you make more money than I do, so you should be fine." And just like that, he dismissed my concerns. What made things even worse was how he spoke to his parents on the phone. He would say, "It's fine. I'm taking care of it with my salary. I won't let her say anything about it." He made it sound like I wasn't involved in this financial burden when, in reality, I was the only one keeping us afloat. And then, the final straw, he had no money left for himself and started asking me for pocket money. "Can you give me about $200? I won't even be able to afford lunch at this rate," he whined. That's when I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. Desperate for change, I suggested, "Let's decide on a monthly limit for how much we send your parents. Please find a way to cover your own expenses." Brian agreed, saying, "Got it. We'll do that." But nothing changed. Month after month, he continued sending his entire paycheck to his parents. No matter how much I pleaded or reasoned with him, he refused to compromise. Then one day, I had to leave for a 2-week business trip. I had been traveling for work since before we got married. Brian knew this. Yet when I told him, his response was, "What? 2 weeks? What am I going to eat then? And what about my laundry?" I was stunned. He was a grown man. Why was he acting like a helpless child? The frustration I had been bottling up finally reached its breaking point. Frustrated by Brian's childishness, I snapped. "Figure it out yourself. You're a grown man. If you can't, why don't you go home while I'm away? You'll be good there, right?" Brian reluctantly agreed. I thought nothing of it at the time. I was just relieved to get away for 2 weeks without worrying about his complaints. But when I returned home, I was not expecting what came next. As soon as I walked through the door, I noticed someone unexpected, Brian's sister, Elizabeth. She lived a little farther away, and I hadn't seen her since our wedding. Before I could even put down my luggage, Elizabeth greeted me cheerfully. "Hi, Louise. It's been a while. Oh, and about the money. It was a lifesaver. Thank you so much." I froze. "Money? What money?" Confused, I asked, "Elizabeth, what are you talking about?" She looked at me like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Huh?" "Brian said that since you have some savings, he'd provide for my startup capital. He told me not to worry, because you had at least $1 million saved up." I felt my stomach drop. Before I could process what she was saying, Brian walked into the room, holding my passbook and seal. With a smug smile, Brian greeted me. "Oh, welcome back. Good timing. I'm going to give your savings to Elizabeth." I couldn't believe my ears. He continued, completely unfazed. "You know Elizabeth is a nail artist, right? She's always wanted her own shop. She's been saving up, but she's about $1 million short. I remembered that you've had exactly that much saved up since before we got married, so I told her to come get it." Then, right in front of me, he handed my passbook and seal to Elizabeth and said, "You're lucky. This will make your dream come true. Be grateful, okay?" That was it. I snapped. "What are you talking about? That's my money. Why are you deciding what to do with it on your own?" Brian, still unfazed, rolled his eyes. "I mean, I could understand if you said you wanted to lend it. But if we did that, we'd need a promissory note and a payment plan, right? Without doing any of that, what do you mean you're just giving away someone else's savings?" I grabbed my passbook and seal back from Elizabeth's hands. Brian looked at me, annoyed, as if I were the one being unreasonable.
What?
We're family, aren't we? It's ridiculous to ask a family member to sign a promissory note. Besides, we're not lending this money. We're giving it. I stood there, speechless. He wasn't done yet. You don't even have a hobby because you're always working, right? It's a waste to just hold on to money like that. Elizabeth has a dream. Isn't it more meaningful to use it to make that dream come true? Then, with cold eyes, he glared at me and said the words that sealed our fate. This money is too good for you, so I'm giving it to Elizabeth. You'd only waste it. You can just work and save up again. Understand? That was when I finally realized I had married a man I could never reason with, and it was time to do something about it. Fed up with Brian's entitlement, I finally snapped. If you still want to argue, we'll get divorced. At that moment, an idea sparked in my mind. This was my chance. Without hesitation, I responded, "All right, let's get a divorce. I'll write up the papers and send them to you. I'll come pick up my things soon. Until the divorce is finalized, I'll stay at a hotel. Bye for now." With that, I grabbed my luggage from my business trip and walked out of the house without looking back. Brian was stunned by how easily I agreed, but it didn't take long for his arrogance to return. That night, he started texting me. Envelope with arrow. You can still come back if you apologize now. Envelope with arrow. Elizabeth says she'll forgive you if you just give her the money. Stop being stubborn and come back. I ignored every single message. Who does he think he is? The next day, I went to City Hall and mailed the signed divorce papers back to him. Even then, he kept texting. Envelope with arrow. Are you really sure about this? I'm going to submit the divorce papers, okay? I sent a single response. Envelope with arrow, please submit them as soon as possible. Then I blocked his number. The divorce was finalized sooner than I expected. A week later, while Brian was at work, I moved all my things into my new house. I took nothing from our old home except my personal belongings. Then, I received another text from Brian. Envelope with arrow. I feel great divorcing an ugly woman like you. We're strangers now. Make sure you divide our property properly, since we're divorced.
Fine.
I'd make sure everything was fair. I left all the furniture and appliances behind. Since we had a small joint savings account with $1,600, I deposited half, exactly $800, into Brian's account. That night, my phone blew up with calls from Brian. I ignored them at first, rolling my eyes. Here we go again. Then, Elizabeth started calling too. Curious, I finally picked up. Brian's furious voice blasted through the phone. Telephone receiver, hey. What happened to the property division? This is ridiculous. There's only $800 in my account. I smirked. Exactly as I expected. Calmly, I explained. Brian, we originally had $1,600 in our joint account. I split it equally, leaving you with $800. The furniture and appliances were purchased after we got married, so I left them all behind for you. That's fair, isn't it? But Brian wasn't convinced. Telephone receiver, what are you talking about? You're supposed to have $1 million in your savings, right? Half of that, $500,000, should be mine. Plus, you have that inheritance from your grandpa. That should be mine too. I burst out laughing. Oh, so that's why he agreed to the divorce so easily. He thought he was getting half of my personal savings and inheritance. Holding back my amusement, I said, Listen, Brian. Property division only applies to marital assets. My savings were from before we got married, and my inheritance isn't included in marital assets either. I don't know where you got your legal advice from, but I actually consulted a lawyer and divided everything fairly. Then, with a bit of sarcasm, I added, Oh, and by the way, all the money in our joint account was earned by me. You never contributed a single penny to our household expenses. Be grateful I even gave you half of that. Brian desperately yelled, Telephone receiver, you're lying. You can't fool me. Hand over the money, or I'll sue you. I rolled my eyes and replied, Go ahead. If you want to sue me, do it. I haven't deceived you in any way. I followed the law. I'm not afraid of being sued. There was silence on the other end. Then, Brian completely backpedaled. Telephone receiver, wait. Louise, let's forget about the divorce. I was wrong. Come back to me. I couldn't help but laugh. Telephone receiver, please, let's just go back to how things were. I took a deep breath and replied, what are you talking about? The divorce is already finalized. I have zero intention of coming back. This is not a joke. Then, just to shatter his last bit of hope, I added, oh, and since this is the end, let me give you a heads up. If you plan on continuing to live in our old apartment, you have to start paying the rent yourself. It's $1,800 a month, by the way. You probably didn't know because you never paid for it. The realization hit him hard. Telephone receiver, there's no way I can afford that. Not my problem anymore. Shortly after, Brian moved back to his parents' house since he couldn't afford rent. To cover his moving expenses, he sold the furniture and appliances I left behind. His parents were thrilled to have him back at first, thinking he'd continue sending them money, but reality hit them fast. Without my income, Brian wasn't able to give them as much as before, making his stay very uncomfortable. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was furious. She had already started preparations for her nail salon, thinking she'd be getting $1 million. But since she didn't get a single penny, she had to cancel everything. From what I heard, Elizabeth gave Brian hell for failing to keep his promise. But honestly, that's not my problem anymore. As for me, I'm focusing on my career and enjoying living alone. I've had enough of marriage. Brian still sends messages sometimes, saying he wants to get back together, but I ignore them completely. At first, I found his updates about his miserable life amusing, but now, I'm tired of hearing from him. So, I think it's time to block him for good. Please feel free to comment below if you like this. Remember to like and subscribers for more.